Good evening and welcome to another episode of Focal Point here on News First. I am Ruhaza Irfan. Today on Focal Point we will be discussing on how and will international communities help Sri Lanka to overcome the current crisis. Now to discuss further we have Kusum Wijetilleke, who is a writer, a researcher, a foreign policy analyst, and he has also worked in the banking sector for over a decade. Thank you Kusum for joining us here on Focal Point.
Thank you for having me, Ruhaza. I appreciate it.
Kusum, now let's start off with the discussion. We know that Sri Lanka has a long history of diplomatic ties, especially with Asia and Southeast Asia as well. However, the current situation of the country, we are faced with a series of crises, be it the political, economical and social crisis. And Sri Lanka got a new Prime Minister a few days ago as well. Against all of this, will the international community help Sri Lanka to overcome this crisis? And where does Sri Lanka stand as a nation diplomatically?
Okay, Ruhaza. So, if I may, as you said, Sri Lanka has always had a very proud, long history of diplomatic relations with many countries. We have embassies all over the world in most of the major nations. Even through the issues with the UNHRC, the Human Rights Commission, we have a very professional generally professional body of diplomats. And I think we've gained respect over the years in the international arena through our engagement, through various forms, be it trade, be it defense issues, etc. But I think, to answer your question, we've been staying afloat, I'd say, for about a year now as a result of bilateral funding, bilateral support from our development partners. So whether it's India and currency swaps, China and their credit lines, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's a number of SAARC nations, Singapore. There's a number of countries that have helped us. They're the reason that we have actually been keeping our head above water, economically speaking. But I think I want to just bring your attention to the fact that most of our bilateral partners have been such for a long time. India, China, Singapore, etc. Now, when you are a bilateral nation, you have all these relationships, especially financial relationships, you're likely to, especially as a lending country, you have a very good understanding of the borrower's financial picture. You have an understanding of the country's balance sheet. Now, for many years, I think for the last 2 years, our bilateral lenders would have probably seen our financial markets, our liquidity, and especially our foreign exchange reserves. They've seen a deterioration in our position. Now, over several months, I would imagine they would have expected us to take some sort of remedial actions to address this foreign currency crisis that we were going through for the last year and a half. And they just would have noticed that we haven't changed course. We haven't altered much in the face of a lot of evidence showing that we should change course, and it just hasn't happened. So when you borrow money from a nation, or from anyone for that matter, they need to see what your revenue projections are going forward. They need to see what your cost projections are and how you intend to pay them back and how you intend to earn foreign currency. Now, I don't see that we have provided any of that information to our creditors, and I think in the last 2 years the policy making process has lacked a certain amount of transparency, and it seems there was very little deliberation between certain members of the cabinet and policymakers. These are all warning signs to our creditors. You know, they will wonder how we missed multiple very obvious warning signs leading up to this position, why we didn't approach the IMF and multilateral agencies before. So all that brings us to your question, is that we have definitely lost credibility in the eyes of the international community. There's no question, when you have a series of very poor decisions being made with no reversal, you tend to lose credibility in the financial markets and with your bilateral investment partners.
Now Kusum, you said that we have lost, international communities don't trust us to lend money to us. If they are to help us, what kind of assistance would they give us?
Well, we've heard multiple politicians discuss bridging finance recently. Even bridging finance is basically a way of saying it's a temporary facility and you're bridging to something else. So it's provided with the understanding that you will also need further finance down the line. That's why it's not just called a loan, it's called a bridging loan or bridging finance. That's one thing that everyone's been talking about. But I think all of it just comes down to, as I said, how much credibility Sri Lanka can show going forward. Now, if you look at, for example, Greece in 2010, Greece underwent a huge financial crisis, and being a member of the European Union, being on the European continent, they received a lot of diplomatic aid, a lot of diplomatic help, medicines, emergency fuel. Of course, considering the size of Greece's problems in 2010, those were rather minuscule, and it's the same thing here. Considering the size of our problems in a Sri Lankan context, the aid we've gotten, while extremely helpful and very generous of our bilateral nations, it's not going to be enough to take us forward. Now, if you concentrate on Sri Lanka's position in the international community, you would notice that over the last 2 years, a lot of scholars, a lot of foreign policy analysts have stated that Sri Lanka has been drifting further and further towards China, that we're essentially in a Chinese orbit or a Chinese satellite of sorts. Now, when you have that kind of dynamic, given the context of the great global political games that are being played between the West, EU versus China, etc., with India in the middle, etc., obviously there are effects of becoming closer to China. And we've seen that in certain instances, for example, the Indian government and the ECT, the East Container Terminal Project, Japan and the Light Rail Terminal Project. So there have been a number of the Muslim burial rights issue and how that will affect our relationships with Arab and Muslim majority countries. So I think we've made a lot of moves that have sort of left our international partners wondering where we stand, on where they stand with us. And now that we're approaching the IMF, we have the opposite issue with China, where they've stated that they're not happy that we've approached the IMF. So as you can see, when you tilt your foreign policy too far in one direction, and when you come to a problem, when you have an emergency, you then have to backtrack. And I think we've seen in the reports that Sri Lanka has backtracked significantly.
Now there is so much going on in the country. There are protests and there are strikes. Against all of this, has this current situation of the country, socially, all social problems, has this painted a negative picture of Sri Lanka, of the international community?
Well, throughout history, a lot of countries, especially in our region, in recent history, have had numerous issues when it comes to agitations, protests, strikes. You can take Thailand for one, that was there in the 90s, in fact throughout the early 2000s as well. India has had a huge national protest from the farming community just this year and last year as well. When these agitations occur, we can't deny that they have a negative impact on how people view Sri Lanka. Now, there's two sides, and how it gets reported in the media abroad matters. But if you look at how Sri Lanka, how we need to be perceived as, for example, one, an investment destination. Two, we need to be perceived as a tourist hub. So an extended period of agitation and protest turning into violence is unlikely to build confidence in either us as an investment destination or as a tourist hub. Now, having said that, during years of conflict with the LTTE, we were still able to attract tourists, we were still able to grow our GDP. So I think what's really important is if we can show that, because I think our multilateral partners have seen that we have what I call a governance deficit. So as I said before, when all these wrong decisions were being made, there was no checks and balances. So I think that unless we show that we have gained new credibility, and we have introduced checks and balances, and that we have addressed that governance deficit, I think these things will play a part in how we're viewed by the international community. I'd also like to state that when it comes to what I mentioned before, that there's a geopolitical scenario to consider. I know that generally speaking, lending institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are supposed to officially not consider geopolitical issues when they address these lending issues. But I think it would be a little bit naive in the context of Sri Lanka's pivot to China. I believe it would be naive for us not to believe that geopolitics has some bearing on how the international community and lending agencies help Sri Lanka.